I stood in the street barefoot, heart pounding, as thick smoke coiled into the sky like a dark omen. The scent of burning wood, insulation, and every memory I'd ever made inside that house wrapped itself around me like a cruel reminder. Flames chewed through the rooftop I once fixed with my own hands, devouring everything I had built. My home, my sanctuary, was gone in a matter of minutes. And I knew exactly who was behind it. You see, this wasn't an accident. This wasn't some electrical short or careless mistake. This was punishment. All because I refused to join the neighborhood's homeowners association. From the day I moved in, the HOA had been relentless, letters about lawn length, paint colors, fence height, even the number of plants in my front yard. But when I dared to push back, to say no to paying outrageous monthly fees and surrendering my independence, they turned on me. First with fines, then with threats, and now with fire. If this injustice shocks you, don't forget to like this video and hit subscribe fire, because what happens next will absolutely blow your mind, and I promise, you won't see it coming. I wasn't just a homeowner. What the HOA didn't know was, I was a judge. Not just any judge, but one with a reputation so feared in the legal world. Whispers of my name had rattled corrupt lawyers for years. And now, the HOA had picked the wrong house to set on fire. As the fire trucks wailed in the distance, and neighbors gathered with their phones out, pretending to worry, I stayed calm. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I watched. I took note of every sneer, every fake expression of sympathy. Especially the smug face of HOA President Sandra Lyles standing across the street with her arms folded and a sick grin curling on her lips. I warned you, she said without shame. We like order around here. Order? This was arson. This was destruction. This was a declaration of war. But I wasn't going to retaliate in rage. I had something far more powerful on my side, the law. And unlike them, I knew exactly how to wield it. The fire was finally out, but the damage was done. My home was a blackened skeleton of what it once was. Fire investigators roamed the property, stepping carefully over charred beams and collapsed furniture, trying to determine the cause. But I already knew the cause. The HOA didn't bother hiding it, not really. Earlier that week, I'd received a letter from the HOA, the sixth in as many months, stating that I was in continued violation of community standards for refusing to join. They claimed I was a disturbance to the uniformity and aesthetic harmony of the neighborhood. A joke, considering my lawn was immaculate and my house had recently won a local design award. But that wasn't enough for Sandra Lyles and her board of self-appointed tyrants. She ran the HOA like a dictatorship, issuing fines, threatening liens, even orchestrating anonymous complaints from neighbors who were too afraid to stand up to her. Most had caved and paid their dues just to avoid the hassle. I didn't. I wasn't just resisting because of pride. I was resisting because I knew what they were doing was unlawful. I'd studied similar cases from the bench, small HOAs overreaching their power, bending bylaws, intimidating homeowners, and skimming money off the top through special assessments and fake maintenance invoices. It was textbook abuse. But in my case, Sandra took it to a whole new level. After the fire, I stayed silent publicly. I didn't speak to reporters. I didn't even confront Sandra. Instead, I got to work. First, I pulled every financial record the HOA had filed with the city, most of which, surprisingly, were sloppily kept and incomplete. I sent legal notices to every vendor they'd claimed to have paid in the last 2 years. Several replied they had never done any work in our neighborhood, despite being listed on HOA reports. One even sent me a copy of a check they'd received. It was written from a personal account under the name Lyles. That was strike one. Then I requested fire department records and surveillance footage from neighbors' doorbell cams. What I found was infuriating: footage of an unfamiliar truck pulling up near my home at 2:37 a.m. the night before the fire, no license plate visible, but the person who stepped out wore a jacket identical to the HOA's security team uniform. He carried a canister. The same man returned just before 3 a.m. and within minutes, flames lit up the night. That was strike two. And the final blow? I subpoenaed Sandra's personal bank account records. As a judge, I had the power to request a preliminary investigation if there was probable cause, and there was. The transactions showed multiple cash deposits matching the HOA's supposed vendor payouts. It wasn't just abuse of power. It was embezzlement, fraud, and now, potentially arson. While all this unfolded quietly, I sat through every HOA meeting with a calm smile. Sandra didn't suspect a thing. She was too proud, too used to her illusion of power. At the next meeting, while she ranted about my non-compliance, I raised my hand and said just one thing. I hope you're ready for a court date. Everyone went silent. Sandra laughed nervously, trying to brush me off, but I handed her the envelope. Inside was a full packet of evidence: fire reports, financial audits, video stills, and my official notice of pending litigation. Her face drained of color. You could feel the fear spread across the room. The board members who had loyally supported her were now glancing between each other, realizing they'd been part of something far bigger than lawn codes and mailbox heights. By the time I walked out, the silence was heavier than the smoke that once filled my house. I wasn't just seeking revenge, I was seeking justice. Not just for myself, but for every homeowner who had been bullied into silence, every family that had paid fees without knowing where the money went, and every neighbor who whispered their discontent but felt powerless to act. This was no longer about a house. This was about tearing down a corrupt system, and I was just getting started. In the days that followed, the neighborhood buzzed with nervous energy. Rumors swirled, fueled by the sudden shift in power. Sandra, once the untouchable queen of the HOA, had gone silent. Her public bravado was replaced by a carefully manufactured absence. No social media posts, no appearances at meetings, and no passive-aggressive notices taped to doors. People started to talk. More importantly, they started to remember. It was as if a fog had lifted. A neighbor named Jeff approached me one evening while I stood by the wreckage of my home. He looked around before speaking, like he was afraid the bushes might be bugged. "I just want you to know," he said in a low voice, "you're doing the right thing." She fined me $500 for a garden gnome. A gnome. I smiled, not because of the gnome, but because I knew I wasn't alone anymore. Word spread fast that I had taken legal action. People started coming forward. One by one, residents shared stories of fines that made no sense, of services charged but never rendered. Ellen from 2 blocks over brought me her stack of HOA letters, all threatening legal action over a non-approved front door color, despite having painted it the exact same shade as her neighbors. Another resident, a quiet man named Victor, admitted he'd been threatened with foreclosure by the HOA for missing a single month's fee, even though he'd paid it and had the bank records to prove it. I compiled every statement, every receipt, every email. This wasn't just about Sandra anymore. It was about systemic abuse. This HOA had been built on fear, on intimidation, and on residents believing they had no power. But now, they were waking up. With everything I had gathered, I filed a formal lawsuit naming Sandra Lyles, the HOA board, and 2 of their affiliated vendors as co-defendants in a case of fraud, misuse of funds, harassment, and potential arson. The district attorney's office took immediate interest when they saw my evidence, especially the financial discrepancies and the suspicious fire. Sandra's personal lawyer tried to settle quietly, but I refused. This needed to be public. People needed to see what could happen when those in power abused their positions, even in something as seemingly small as a homeowners association. The court date was set, and the neighborhood waited with bated breath. On the day of the hearing, I walked into the courthouse not as a victim, but as someone finally taking back control. News outlets had picked up the story by then. Judge battles corrupt HOA in landmark case. I didn't care about the headlines, though. I cared about what came next. Sandra sat in the defendant's chair, her usual smugness gone. Her lawyer fumbled through objections, but the facts were overwhelming. Financial records showed over $120,000 in missing funds, video evidence tied her to private contractor deals made off the books, and the fire investigation revealed the accelerant used was the same brand purchased by the HOA security team weeks earlier. When the judge, not me but a respected colleague, asked her directly about the fire, Sandra said nothing. She simply lowered her head. The ruling came swiftly. Sandra was found guilty of fraud, harassment, and obstruction of justice. The arson charge was still under criminal investigation, but it didn't matter, her reign of fear was over. The HOA board was dissolved by court order. An independent trustee was appointed to manage community affairs until a new board could be fairly elected. And as for my home? The city offered compensation, but I turned it down. I had a different plan in mind. Because in all of this chaos, something extraordinary happened. The neighborhood came alive. People who had never spoken to each other were now organizing meetings. They wanted to create a community, not a dictatorship. They wanted transparency, kindness, unity. So I made an announcement at the first open meeting. I'm rebuilding, I said. And I'm staying. The crowd erupted in applause. I wasn't going anywhere. This neighborhood was my home, not just the land but the people. And together, we were going to make sure no one ever suffered like this again. The sun rose differently the day after the verdict, brighter, warmer, and somehow more hopeful. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. The legal victory wasn't just mine, it belonged to every neighbor who had endured the quiet tyranny of Sandra's HOA regime. But even with the ruling in our favor, I knew this wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. After the dust settled, a temporary community board was established under the court-appointed trustee. I was asked to serve as an advisor due to my experience, not just as a judge, but as someone who had lived through the nightmare and fought back. I agreed, but only if real changes would be made. And they were. Within the first month, we rewrote the HOA bylaws from scratch. Gone were the vague, punitive clauses Sandra had used to manipulate residents. In their place, we drafted clear, fair, and transparent rules. No more fines for small personal touches like wind chimes, garden gnomes, or the wrong shade of beige on a mailbox post. We added a clause requiring all financial records to be publicly accessible and independently audited quarterly. At our first town hall meeting under the new guidelines, over 90% of the neighborhood showed up. Some came with tears in their eyes. Others with folded arms and raised eyebrows. They were skeptical, and who could blame them? But as I stood before them in the community center gymnasium, I told them what I had once wished someone had told me. This isn't about revenge. This is about rebuilding. Not just homes, but trust. Applause echoed across the room. For the first time in a long time, there was unity. We hosted open yard days where residents helped each other with landscaping projects, cleaning up old debris and repainting mailboxes together. It was strange at first, almost surreal, to see the same people who once whispered anxiously now laughing over shared paint rollers and lemonade. But not everything was easy. A few board loyalists, those who had once thrived under Sandra's corrupt rule, tried to stir up resistance. They claimed the new leadership was too soft, that rules were necessary, and that community order was falling apart. One man even tried to call the local news to accuse me of bias. Ironically, the same network that covered Sandra's conviction laughed him off the air. Still, I understood their fear. Change, even for the better, can be unsettling. So rather than alienate them, we invited them into the process. Every resident, no matter how opposed they were initially, had a chance to contribute to the future of the community. One of the biggest breakthroughs came when Ellen, the neighbor who had once feared Sandra over her front door color, was elected as the new board secretary. She cried when the results were read. "I never thought I'd be part of something like this," she whispered to me after the meeting. "I was just trying to keep my head down." Now, she was helping lead the charge. I moved into a temporary rental a few blocks away while the rebuilding of my home began. The fire had destroyed everything, memories, furniture, personal treasures, but it couldn't take away my will. I worked closely with the architect to design not just a house, but a symbol. Large front porch, community space in the backyard, solar panels, native plants in the landscaping, it was everything the HOA had once opposed, and everything we now stood for. And then came the day I got the keys. Walking through the door of my new home was emotional. Not because of what was gone, but because of what we had gained. Solidarity. The second chance. That evening, the neighborhood threw a block party in my honor. There were food trucks, music, and laughter that echoed down every street. Kids raced around on scooters, and adults swapped stories over drinks under string lights. The same streets that had once felt cold and monitored now felt alive and free. As the party went on, I looked out across the crowd and felt something I hadn't felt in years: peace. But I also knew this wasn't just my victory. It was a reminder for everyone watching, on the news, online, or from behind their blinds, that even in the face of corruption, we still have power. That no matter how dark things get, there is always a way forward if you're willing to stand up and fight. The celebration was a breath of fresh air, but even amidst the laughter and twinkling lights, a small thought lingered in the back of my mind. What if this happens again? Corruption doesn't vanish, it adapts. And while we had taken down Sandra and rebuilt from the ashes, quite literally, I knew that without long-term safeguards, the HOA could easily slip back into the same darkness. That realization haunted me more than the fire ever could. So, I made a decision. I filed for permanent election to the HOA board, not as a figurehead, not as someone who simply filled a chair, but as its president. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very position that had once wielded so much unchecked power would now be occupied by the man it had tried to destroy. When the votes were tallied, it wasn't even close. Unanimous. For the first time in our HOA's history, every resident cast a ballot, and every one of them had chosen me. In my first official act, I established what we came to call the HOA Transparency Code. It was a simple but powerful document. The required open financial books updated monthly and emailed to all residents. Annual town audits conducted by third-party professionals, not friends of the board. Community oversight committees, rotating every 6 months, so no single group could dominate the narrative. And most importantly, no fines or penalties without a resident vote. We printed these out and delivered them with welcome baskets to every door in the neighborhood. Some folks got emotional reading it. Not because of the words on the page, but because of what it represented: trust. But leadership, even when welcomed, came with its challenges. I spent late nights responding to emails and calls. Not complaints, per se, but stories. People finally felt safe enough to speak. One neighbor, Mrs. Tinsley, revealed how Sandra had threatened to report her disabled husband for violating parking regulations when he had to use the driveway ramp. Another, a teenage girl named Molly, had been forced to remove a rainbow flag from her bedroom window, something the board deemed too political. These weren't violations. They were lives quietly oppressed. So I did something bold. We held a Stories of the Street night at the community center. No boardroom. No agendas. Just a microphone and open floor. What happened next stunned even me. One by one, residents came forward with stories they had buried for years. About harassment. About being told their families didn't fit the neighborhood image. About being fined until they couldn't afford groceries. There were tears, anger, applause. And when it was done, silence, the heavy kind, not awkward, but sacred. Healing. The old HOA would have labeled this chaos. We called it community. We began weekly walk and talks, where board members, including myself, walked the neighborhood and listened. We didn't hand out warnings or snap photos of overgrown grass. We listened. One elderly man invited us in for tea. Another offered us cookies. These were the same people who once peeked through curtains whenever an HOA car came by. They waved. They smiled. But I wasn't blind. I knew other HOAs were watching. News of our transformation had reached local newspapers, then statewide blogs. A few even reached out for interviews. The judge who rewrote the HOA rulebook, one headline said, "I laughed at the dramatics, but deep down I was proud." And it wasn't about me, it was about the message. You can fight back. You can win. And when you do, you don't just reclaim your house, you reclaim your home. Of course, there were still skeptics. A former board ally of Sandra's accused me of being a soft ruler, someone who let the neighborhood become too casual. But when residents saw how much happier, united, and safer the community was, their complaints quickly faded. We were thriving. Together. Looking back, I realized the fire hadn't destroyed us. It had purified us. removed the layers of silence and fear and exposed something far stronger beneath: resilience. But one thing stayed with me most. At the next HOA election, a young woman stepped up to run for vice president. Molly, the same girl forced to take down her rainbow flag. When asked why she wanted to run, she said, "Because for the first time, I believe this community belongs to everyone." And that made everything worth it. Some stories end with a bang. Others with a whisper. It ended with a quiet sunrise, a cup of coffee in hand, and the sense that, for once, everything was right where it should be. It had been over a year since I became HOA president. A year since I stood in the ashes of my old life and decided to build something better, not just for myself, but for everyone in our neighborhood. And now, as I looked out over the street where it all began, I saw life blooming in ways we never thought possible. Gardens once fined for being too wild were now encouraged for their beauty. Kids rode bikes past homes that once felt like prisons, now filled with laughter. Neighbors who had never spoken before now exchanged morning greetings like old friends. It was peace, but not the kind that comes from silence. It was the kind that comes from being seen, heard, and respected. And it all started with a lie. With theft. With betrayal. Funny how the darkest moments plant the seeds for the brightest changes. Sandra, the corrupt former president, had finally gone quiet. After her arrest and trial, she tried to smear our HOA online, calling us ungrateful radicals. But the truth spoke louder. People could see the difference now. We weren't radicals, we were human. And we had rebuilt something real. The final audit showed just how deep her crimes had gone: over $300,000 in misappropriated fees, unauthorized vendor deals, and personal purchases ranging from luxury furniture to vacations. The worst part? She'd convinced herself she was entitled to it, that she deserved it. But justice had a funny way of humbling people. And while she served her sentence, our neighborhood healed. I had learned so much about people during this journey: how quickly fear spreads when power is unchecked, how easily silence becomes complicity. But I also learned something else. People want to do the right thing. Sometimes they just need someone to show them how. That's what we became. Not enforcers. Not rulers. But examples. Our HOA meetings turned into community gatherings. Not sterile, boring sessions of policy and penalty, but potlucks, movie nights, and open mic discussions. And slowly, other HOAs started reaching out, asking how we did it, what tools we used. We could help them too. So we shared everything. Not because we wanted recognition, but because no one else should have to burn before they can rebuild. And me? I finally started living again. My daughter, the one who had watched me spiral into despair, now laughed more freely. We planted flowers together. She made friends. She even started a little neighborhood newsletter where she interviewed residents, calling it The Front Porch Times. She made me proud. One day, I asked her what she thought of all this, of the changes, the journey, the neighborhood. She said, "I like it now. It feels like home." Those 6 words broke me, in the best way. Because that was all I ever wanted. To live somewhere we didn't just survive, but belonged. I realized then that stories like ours don't need to be loud to be powerful. Sometimes all it takes is standing up, once, even when it's scary, to change everything. We still had rules. We still had guidelines. But now they were created with the community, not against it. And me? I didn't plan on being HOA president forever. I believe in term limits, in fresh eyes and new perspectives. So I trained others, shared my knowledge. And when the next election came around, I stepped aside with peace in my heart, handing the baton to a neighbor who once told me she was afraid to speak at meetings. But she led them. That's real change. And as for me, I kept my role as a mentor, a guide, and most of all, a neighbor. One who never forgot what it felt like to be pushed out of your own home, and who made sure no one ever had to feel that way again. Because at the end of the day, we all just want a place to belong. And sometimes, when no one else will fight for it, you have to build it yourself.